Hello and welcome to my channel. This is the first video in a series of videos I hope to do on the greatest scenes, reading from the greatest moments and scenes in all of literature. And today we're going to start with a scene that might be the greatest and powerful, stunning, exciting scene in all of literature. And that is the scene, the moment when James Boswell finally meets Samuel Johnson. Of course, James Boswell is the biographer who compiled a massive tome of a biography of all these notes from years and years of his friendship and correspondence, but mostly in-person friendship with the literary giant Samuel Johnson. And he would meticulously write down and record all these notes contemporaneous to his time with Samuel Johnson. He compiled this huge amount of data into this massive, sprawling biography. And it's a book without any peer in its scope, in the level of intimacy that's being portrayed between these two friends. Sort of the amazing vividness of these two very distinct characters and the way in which they interact in complicated ways, the ways in which their friendship is often strained, and the ways in which Boswell is often quite judgmental, although sometimes quite subtly judgmental. He writes his judgment in sort of a backhanded, coded way of the illustrious Johnson. And the fact that Johnson is limited. He's a limited man. He's limited in his capacity for certain kinds of conversations, certain kinds of friendship. And all this comes across in a remarkable way, in a remarkable amount of vividness. In the beginning of Life of Johnson, Boswell talks about this project of biography that he's embarking on. And he makes a defense for his choice to be so meticulous and so detail-oriented and to put so much effort and work into this massive project. He writes as follows, quote, "Indeed, I cannot conceive a more perfect mode of writing any man's life than not only relating all the most important events of it in their order, but interweaving what he privately wrote and said and thought, by which mankind are enabled, as it were, to see him live, and to live over each scene with him, as he actually advanced through the several stages of his life. Had his other friends been as diligent and ardent as I was, he might have been almost entirely preserved. As it is, I will venture to say that he will be seen in this work more completely than any man who has ever yet lived. And he will be seen as he really was, for I profess to write not his panegyric, which must be all praise, but his life." End quote. And that's such an amazing introduction, and Boswell is right. Boswell is absolutely correct. This is a description of a person that has no peer, that's never been done before. It is a unique confluence of two personalities who sort of merged in this way, in this complicated way. And the level of commitment and also the prodigious memory of James Boswell to write down everything Samuel Johnson said, to cling to this person. And we're going to get a little more of a description of that in a minute as we sort of build up to this fateful, exciting meeting of these two characters. So the book starts by telling the story of Samuel Johnson's life in the way which is quite typical of biography, talking about his parents, talking about his childhood, talking about the stories of his childhood, talking about his marriage to his wife, and all the sorts of interesting set pieces you'd expect to see in his biography, quoting lots of sources, pulling from his letters. And that takes us to like almost a fourth of the book, We're deep into the book at this point. And finally, we get this fateful moment in the book. We've learned a lot about Johnson. We've learned a lot about his particularities. He has tics, like Tourette's. He has strange gesticulations that sort of surprise people at times. He's brilliant. He's at this point in his life written his famous dictionary, which took him 3 years, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but it was a monumental achievement for the English language at the time. He's written The Rambler, which are all these like essays. So he's well known. And we finally reach this moment in the book. Quote, This is to me a memorable year, for in it I had the happiness to obtain the acquaintance of that extraordinary man whose memoirs I am now writing, an acquaintance which I shall ever esteem as one of the most fortunate circumstances in my life. Though then but 22, I had for several years read his works with delight and instruction, and had the highest reverence for their author, which had grown up in my fancy into a kind of mysterious veneration, by figuring to myself a state of solemn, elevated abstraction in which I supposed him to live in the immense metropolis of London. End quote. And this is so critical and fascinating. This young 22-year-old man, we learn in a little bit that at this time, Boswell is aimless. He's debating if he should study to become a lawyer. He's from Scotland originally, but he's loving the metropolis of London at this time. He writes, we'll see in a moment, that he was sort of living a loose, dissipated, non-religious lifestyle. And he feels sort of this attraction to the figure of Samuel Johnson. And this is unusual, but it's not unheard of, right? It's unusual for someone to create this kind of a guru for themselves and then cling to that guru. But it happens, right? Human beings do this sometimes. And this is clearly what happened. I imagine this is sort of just purely from the analogy of other experiences that I've seen, in my own life, in my own interacting with people and these, quote, sages and these relationships between students and teachers. Sometimes there's like this father hunger, right? Sometimes you have these young people who are alienated from their family and they're looking for like a father figure. And that's what I see in Boswell, aimless, wandering, and he just builds up this character of Johnson who he wants to meet. In the next scene we're going to read, we finally have the meeting. We finally have this moment. But before I read that, I want to read another quote from a little bit earlier in the book, where Boswell gives a little bit of context, gives a little bit of color to what it means to meet Samuel Johnson for the first time. And he does it by recounting a different person's experience, the experience of a Mr. Langton. So Mr. Langton and Dr. Johnson became friends, and they were close friends. But Boswell tells us about the first time Mr. Langton met Dr. Johnson. And there's no doubt that this is a testimony, an experience, which rhymes and is analogous and parallel to Boswell's own experience of meeting Johnson for the first time. Quote, Mr. Langton was exceedingly surprised when the sage first appeared. He had not received the smallest intimation of his figure, dress, or manner. From perusing his writings, he fancied he should see a decent, well-dressed, in short, a remarkably decorous philosopher. Instead of which, down from his bedchamber, about noon, came as newly risen a huge, uncouth figure, with a little dark wig which scarcely covered his head, and his clothes hanging loose about him. Right? So there's the shock of seeing Dr. Johnson for the first time. But we're told immediately afterwards, quote, but his conversation was so rich, so animated, and so forcible, and his religious and political notions so congenial with those in which Mr. Langton had been educated, that he conceived for him that veneration and attachment which he ever preserved, end quote. And there's no doubt that this is reflective. This is indicative of Boswell's own experience. So now we get to this fateful moment. This is the scene. These are the sentences that, for me, are undoubtedly some of the greatest in all of literature. Some of the most striking, impactful, critical, exciting. So for me, at least, I can only speak for myself, but such powerful, like a thunderbolt in the sky of literature. Quote, at last, on Monday the 16th of May, when I was sitting in Mr. Davies' back parlor, after having drunk tea with him and Mrs. Davies, Johnson unexpectedly came into the shop, and Mr. Davies, having perceived him through the glass door, in the room in which we were sitting, advancing toward us, he announced his awful approach to me, somewhat in the manner of an actor in the part of Horatio, when he addresses Hamlet on the appearance of his father's ghost. Look, my lord, it comes. End quote, right? And this is this amazing moment where Boswell's going to meet Johnson for the first time. Boswell has notes on this scene. He took notes. They were a little sparser than Boswell would have liked. He later falls into this cadence of taking very extensive notes on everything. But he has notes on this first scene. He remembers the way in which Johnson, who's so sharp with his tongue, who's so witty, made fun of him for coming from Scotland. And Boswell is a precocious character. He intervenes, he interjects into conversations which are sort of unexpected of him. And there's a moment in these opening interactions where, like, Johnson says, like, who are you to, like, give me advice on this topic, and like quiets him. And that's sort of like the eccentricity, the marriage of these two eccentricities. Boswell is a super eccentric guy. He has this precociousness about him, which is so interesting. So we get this follow-up meeting. He visits Johnson at his home. And this, of course, again, highlights the experience of what it was like to become so close with Samuel Johnson, who Samuel Johnson was. So Boswell recounts, this is just a few paragraphs later after their first meeting, visiting Johnson in his home. Quote, "He received me very courteously, but it must be confessed that his apartment and furniture and morning dress were sufficiently uncouth. His brown suit of clothes looked very rusty. He had on a little old, shriveled, unpowdered wig, which was too small for his head. His shirt neck and knees of his breeches were loose, his black worsted stockings ill drawn up, and he had a pair of unbuckled shoes by way of slippers. But all these slovenly particularities were forgotten the moment he began to talk." Skipping a few sentences here, Boswell says to him, "I'm afraid that I intrude upon you. It is benevolent to allow me to sit and hear you." Now we get Johnson's response. "He seemed pleased with this compliment, which I sincerely paid him, and answered, 'Sir, I am obliged to any man who visits me.'" Right? And this is sort of the first sense that we get that the miracle of this union is you have this sort of aimless young person who's looking for his sage, looking for his guru, looking for something to do with his life. And he sort of is in love with the ideas and the power, the language, and the writing of a Samuel Johnson. And you have Samuel Johnson, who is in many ways limited, but is also deeply lonely and deeply appreciates the company. Before we read a little further about these initial encounters, I want to just take a moment to reflect on the character of Samuel Johnson. Despite his brilliance and his genius, he was a difficult character. He was someone that was hard to converse with. He was someone who was often making enemies with people. People didn't like him, and Boswell sees himself often filling the role of having to defend Johnson against all his critics. The book, The Life of Samuel Johnson, is filled with Boswell saying the critics are unjustified in deriding Johnson this way and that way, because Johnson was difficult. And we get one example of this early on in the book. Boswell describes Johnson in a kind of a restaurant, making conversation with a stranger. Okay? So this is Boswell describing this scene that he witnessed firsthand in London. So he describes sort of the setting here. He says, quote, "The mode of dining, or rather being fed, at such houses in London is well known to many to be particularly unsocial, as there is no ordinary or united company, but each person has his own mess, and is under no obligation to hold any intercourse with anyone." Skipping a bit, Boswell says, "But Johnson would make conversation with people." So he continues, "Johnson and an Irish gentleman got into a dispute concerning the cause of some part of mankind being black. 'Why, sir,' said Johnson, 'it has been accounted for in three ways, either by supposing that they are the posterity of Ham, who was cursed, or that God at first created two kinds of men, one black and another white, or that by the heat of the sun the skin is scorched, and so acquires a sooty hue. The matter has been much canvassed among naturalists, but has never been brought to any certain issue. What the Irishman said is totally obliterated from my mind, but I remember that he became very warm and intemperate in his expressions, upon which Johnson rose and quietly walked away. When he had retired, his antagonist took his revenge, as he thought, by saying he has a most ungainly figure and an affectation of pomposity unworthy of a man of genius, end quote, right? And that is such a typical scene and such an important, illuminating scene of the character of Johnson. He's very difficult to talk to. He's very good at lecturing at you. He has a lot of opinions, He can tell you the 3 reasons why there are why there are black-skinned people in the world, And he does not really care what you have to say, and he's extremely pompous. And he sort of fails often in his ability to have like normal human conversation. And of course, this Irishman thought this is a completely unpleasant conversation. I don't want to be lectured at, is probably what he was feeling. And he says, the affectation of pomposity is unworthy of a man of genius. And this is sort of a tension that runs through the book, that Boswell, in his travels with Johnson, is dealing with this kind of a person, who is so brilliant, who's so interesting, but also has this limitation. I think in modern language, we would say there's kind of like an Asperger's here, a kind of an irrelational difficulty in socializing in a certain way. A kind of like a color blindness to some of the color of human relationships and human socialization and conversation and emotion. So that seems to be what's going on. Of course, obviously, in this time, that language didn't exist, And so for lots of people, Johnson is like an enigma. He's like very hard to understand. And people have like weird theories in the book about how he ended up the way he is, But there's one moment which I want to highlight because I think it's as close as we get to really putting one's finger on what made Johnson limited. And early in the book, this is before the meeting of Boswell and Johnson, we're told about a play, a piece of drama for the stage that Samuel Johnson composed. He wrote it. It's called Irene. And it did not do well. People didn't come to see it. It was put on because one of Johnson's close friends and a former student is this actor Garrick, who at this point in the book owns like a lot of theater houses, and he's able to put on the show for Johnson, but it had a very short run and was not well received. So Boswell, in his style, defends Johnson, defends sort of the composition a little bit. He says, quote, Irene, considered as a poem, is entitled to the praise of superior excellence. Analyzed into parts, it will furnish a rich store of noble sentiments, fine imagery, and beautiful language. But it is deficient in pathos, in that delicate power of touching the human feelings, which is the principal end of the drama. Indeed, Garrick has complained to me that Johnson not only had not the faculty of producing the impressions of tragedy, but that he had not the sensibility to perceive them. End quote. And I think that's an amazing moment in the book where Garrick, who's this friend of Johnson, this mutual friend, sort of says outright that there's like a kind of a color blindness here. There's a kind of a limitation. There's something missing. But in their mutual eccentricity, in their mutual needs, the loneliness of Johnson and the searching for the sage of Boswell, a certain kind of magic happens. Going back to the sections we were reading earlier, when we had the initial meetings between Boswell and Johnson. Quote, he told me that he generally went abroad at 4 PM and seldom came home till 2 AM. Right? You understand? So he's out all night, basically, until 2 AM, Johnson. Unmarried. And what's implied here, which is implied throughout the book, is that there's a dark side to Johnson's behavior, which Boswell omits and only sort of hints at. And this is an example of that. So that Boswell sees that his sage has a little bit of a, uncouth or not so respectable element in his life. So Boswell says, continuing, reading the quote, I took the liberty to ask if he did not think it wrong to live thus and not make more use of his great talents. He owned it was a bad habit. Boswell continues, on reviewing at the distance of many years, my journal of this period, I wonder how, at my first visit, I ventured to talk to him so freely and that he bore it with so much indulgence, end quote. And that is typical That is typical of Boswell. What makes him so unique and so weird is his own eccentricities, which allow him to be so forward with Johnson. There's another quote in the book, which I'm not going to read inside because I don't have it copied out here, but I remember that Johnson is in a dispute with Lord Chesterfield. And Lord Chesterfield writes this like very mean satire send up of Johnson. And everyone knows he's talking about Johnson. But Johnson doesn't think it's about him. Johnson thinks it's about someone else, right? And you can imagine sort of defense mechanism. It's a very insulting caricature of Johnson. And everyone thinks it's about Johnson. But Johnson doesn't see it that way. And Johnson thinks it's about this other person in their social life. And Boswell says to Johnson, but you must admit there's at least one element of that caricature which does not apply to this other person, right? So Boswell's saying in a roundabout way, like, clearly this is about you, not about this other person. And the caricature that clearly is not about this other person, but is about you, is the fact that he throws his food everywhere he eats. When he eats, he's like a total mess, and the food is everywhere. And then to which Johnson responds, Lord Chesterfield never saw me eat, But again, there's a chutzpah there, a profound boldness, temerity, which makes this relationship so interesting and this project so unique. Skipping a bit, quote, he again shook me by the hand at parting and asked me why I did not come oftener to him. Trusting that I was now in his good graces, I answered that he had not given me much encouragement and reminded him of the check I had received from him at our first interview. Right? Basically, Boswell saying at leaving, I'm not coming more often because you were sort of mean to me in the beginning. You were very dismissive of certain things that I said, whatever. Pooh, said he, with a complacent smile. Never mind these things. Come to me as often as you can. I shall be glad to see you, end quote. And that is the scene, that is the meeting between James Boswell and Samuel Johnson, which is the first in our series of videos on the topic of the greatest scenes, the most monumentous, exciting, powerful, compelling scenes in all of literature, for which I hope you will join me. Thank you for watching.